Greetings to everyone. It is great to be here with you today. I'm Therese Radcliffe, the Director of Liturgical Press, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's online event. What's next for our listening church? The ongoing Synod process after the October Assembly. A conversation with Dr. Myriam Wijlens, Father Timothy Radcliffe, and moderated by Dr. Kristen Kohlberg. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes to share with everyone. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your cameras and microphones have been turned off for the duration of the event. Also, we are recording today's event, and in the coming days, we'll email a link of the final recording to everyone who registered. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit them. We hope to have time at the end of the presentation to get to as many of these as possible, so you'll be sure you want to submit them now. And finally, as a registered attendee, you will receive a 20% discount and free shipping on your next purchase from LitPress. So go to litpress.org and enter the code NOVWEB23 to take advantage of this special offer before November 15th. That promo code will appear in the chat box here, and it will also be included in the email that accompanies the event recording. And now I am really happy to introduce you to the moderator for today's conversation, Dr. Kristen Kohlberg. Kristen Kohlberg is Associate Professor of Theology at St. John's University and School of Theology in the College of St. Benedict, and she is the sole U.S. member on the Theological Commission for the Synod on Synodality. She received her doctorate at the University of Notre Dame in Systematic Theology. She is the author of Vatican I and Vatican II, Councils in the Living Tradition from LitPress in 2016, and the co-editor of Speaking Truth in Love, Festschrift in honor of Cardinal Walter Casper, LitPress 2014. Professor Kohlberg also serves as a member of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Kohlberg. And now I am absolutely thrilled to introduce to you our two featured speakers, Dr. Myriam Wijlens and Father Timothy Radcliffe. Dr. Wijlens, official consultor on the Synod to Synodality, is a professor of canon law in the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Erfurt and co-moderator of the Peter and Paul Seminar. On behalf of the Dicastery for Christian Unity, she's a member of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches and a consultant to the Roman Catholic Anglican International Commission. She's the sole female member of the coordinating committee of the Synod on Synodality and participated as an expert in the October Assembly that just finished. She also served on the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors from 2018 to 2022. Welcome, Dr. Wijlens. And we have Father Timothy Radcliffe, Retreat Master and Spiritual Advisor for the Synod on Synodality. He is a member of the Dominican community at Blackfriars, Oxford, and was Master General of the Order of Preachers from 1992 to 2001. He's the only member of the English province of the Dominicans to have held that office since the order's foundation in the year 1216. Father Timothy is the author of a number of very popular theology books and an editorial advisor and contributor to Give Us This Day, published by Liturgical Press. So again, a warm welcome to everyone here. I'll turn the conversation over now to the three of you.
Thank you so much, Therese. It is really my great pleasure and honor to have Timothy and Myriam here with us today, two leaders in the Synod process, and I'm glad to say two friends. I could speak with you at great length about their brilliance and their creativity and their unique contributions to the church, but we have a lot of ground to cover in this next hour, and we're eager to hear what they have to say about their time in Rome last month. So I will just briefly say thanks. Thanks to both of you for your incredible service to the church and your support of the Synod, and thanks for being here. And also to all of those of you who are watching this conversation, thank you for your interest in the Synod. The Synod isn't just happening in Rome. It happens when all of us do our part to help move the church forward on this synodal journey. Okay, so you both just attended this historic meeting in Rome. Can you tell us a little bit about the roles that you played and what it was like to be in the room? What was it like to be there? What was your experience of being part of this group and part of this process? So Timothy, can we start with you? Oh, Timothy, you're still mute.
I'm unmuted now.
I guess.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. When I got the phone call from the Holy Father asking me to give the retreat, I must admit I was completely terrified. And I understood that my role as giving the retreat was to try to understand what separated people, what made conversation difficult. And first of all, I had to name the problems. The first day. The second was to try to see how you reach beyond those divisions in friendship and imagination. And then in the third day, to see how we find a way forward in the spirit. And then during the Synod itself, I had a slightly different role. I was working with the wonderful Mother Maria Ignatia from Milan, a Benedictine. And our role principally was to introduce each section of the Synod process during that month. And there were 5. And we had to find biblical texts that would anticipate what is going to be difficult, what people will find difficult to talk about. So, for example, when one section, we began to look at institutional change, innovation, I took the Council of Jerusalem and tried to show how it faced a much more profound problems than we ever do. The rest of the time I sat at a desk, Maria Ignatia, myself, and 3 rather grand cardinals, including Walter Kasper, we sat at the edge, not taking part in the cercoli di mori, the little circles, but waiting like the day laborers, waiting to be hired, and being available for any conversation that anybody wished to have.
Now, Myriam, you were an expert at the Synod. What did that involve?
Well, thank you also for having this wonderful event. I'm really delighted that we can share our experience with so many people from around the world. And I think this is also, if you like, the task with which we were sent forth. This was not just a meeting behind closed doors, not to be shared, but so to get everybody on board, and the train is running and everybody can still join the train. So I think it's really great. Timothy was saying he was surprised when he got a phone call. I was similarly surprised in 2021 when around 11:30 in the evening, I got an email from Cardinal Mario Grech, who is responsible for the synodal process, asking if I would be willing to be on the steering committee for this whole synod. And I thought, okay, it's a bit surprising. Then I got first a letter saying this was still COVID time. There was no need to come. I could do this by Zoom. And I thought, no. When I discovered there were going to be 4 Italians and myself, I thought if I'm not in the room, it will be a conversation of the Italians over coffee break, and I will miss out. So I decided that I was able to fly back and forth. And ever since the beginning, I have been able to participate in thinking what can be the next steps in this process, and also to listen to the documents that came in, and then to prepare the documents for the next phase. So when we had this huge continental sessions in all the 7 continents as we had it, I was part of also of the drafting team in Prague, in this case then in Europe. So that was wonderful. Being an expert on the Synod, we were with 4 canon lawyers as a group, in maybe 20, 25 experts, I guess. Yeah, I was the only woman. I am the only woman in that. And I discovered that I was invited because of the research that we have been doing over the years with this group, and in which, Christine, you now participate, the so-called Peter and Paul Seminar. And last year we had the privilege of inviting and having with us Timothy Radcliffe to think about an accountable church. And we just see that so many of these subjects have now come up in the Synod. So we did very important groundwork, and we hope we will continue to do that. As an expert, what would we do? So how did this group work? It was for the first time, if I may just explain. In the past, they would sit in a kind of audience hall in an amphitheater style. And one African bishop said to me, oh, you would go there in the morning, you would fall asleep, and in the evening you would wake up when the school bell was ringing that you could go home. And you were seated, he said, for 4 weeks beside the same person in the room in which you couldn't breathe. Now, as a gift, I would say, this is the Catholicity of the church, a gift from the church in Asia, we discovered that round tables can do wonders. So there were 10 people seated at a round table, and those were cardinals, bishops, priests, men and women, religious, and they were organized by language and by the topic that they had chosen that they wanted to speak about. And they would meet at this round table and go into a conversation. And this, I think, was so decisive in the whole meeting, was the method of how do we together listen to each other. The key word was to listen. And I would say the church has moved from a teaching, a preaching, a teaching and a preaching church and a proclaiming church to first being a listening church, listening to the word of God. So the experts were there to listen to what these groups had come up with. And we can maybe say later more about that whole process, but it was so important how that process went. And we would then together see, and we did this also in 4 languages. The whole meeting was in 5 languages simultaneously. We would then try to find out what are the convergences, what are the issues that people see need further study, and this is to be done in the coming 12 months, and what are ways to move forward. So we have tried to put that together so that for the 4 writers who were there, 2 in English, 2 in Italian, they would have a basis to work on and to draft a document.
Really, that's so interesting. I mean, one of the things that Myriam talked about is the global character of this meeting. Timothy, how do you think that the global character impacted the conversations during that month?
It's a fascinating question, Kristen. I'm used to global international meetings. Every general chapter of the Dominicans, we have representatives from over 100 countries. But my perception of the challenges changed a little bit during the Synod. I don't think I'd registered until the Synod what a shift we are undergoing in the world. I think many of us had worked on the assumption after the fall of the Berlin Wall, what Fukuyama called the end of history, that we were moving towards a universal sort of democratic system, that basically people all over the world were going to catch up with our way of being and our way of thinking. And what I think became very clear during the Synod is that this is not actually how things are happening. We are living in a multipolar world. You could see this in reactions to the war in Ukraine, in reactions to the conflict in the Middle East. Alliances are shifting, and we're entering this different sort of world where the West is not seen as the future. And I think this touches the church too. I think that very often our assumption has been that our articulation of problems like, for example, welcome of gay people, look, we were leading the way. We were the future. And what we discovered, and this is a global problem, it's not just the church, what we discovered is actually more complex. And I think quite a lot of Catholics around the world look at the West and see us as in decline and wonder what right we have to tell them about how to live as Catholics when our churches are emptying and theirs are full. So this meant that the discussion, the global discussion that we were engaged in was more fundamental, ultimately much more interesting, much more challenging than I had realized. And it's one reason why I think that when people look at where we've got to so far, it's a long process. There's another part of the Synod next year. When they look at where we got to, they might sometimes feel disappointed. We hadn't achieved what they had hoped. But that's because we're involved in a process which is far more fundamental than I think I'd realized. It's how we are a community, a global community across space and time, in which we let ourselves be changed by the contact we have with each other. Because as Myriam pointed out, these little groups around the table, I think it was a transformative experience for many people. Cardinals, Roman curial cardinals, found that they were living day by day with young women, lay people from Latin America and Asia, being addressed often by their first name. And I think it had enormous consequences. And we are only at the beginning of understanding the challenge that gives to all of us to grow up and to grow and become one in Christ.
Thank you so much, Timothy. Myriam, would you like to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I also felt, I mean, I've been reading in my life because of my studies a lot about Vatican II, and at Vatican II, Karl Rahner said, this is now a world church. But I think if you would really look at it, the bishops who were present were in very many bishops, I guess, who were missionaries, if you like, from European congregations. And today, the bishops who were there from Asia, from Africa, they are the second, the third generation of Christians in that country. And what I felt, I had the privilege, I mean, this is the other thing. One thing is the Synod Hall, the other one is the dining room. So you sit in the, I mean, that's a whole different story. I know some of my colleagues decided to have a private apartment. I thought to myself, no, I really want to be with the people from the morning till the evening, to hear also what's happening at the dining room table. And there you had different groups speaking again with each other, but I had the privilege of being with bishops from India, from Africa, Asia, and it was really a great conversation we had. But really realizing how they are also struggling with decolonialization and the question of identity. So who are we if we are not under the influence of the people who came to colonialize us? And I think we have to respect that process. I learned over the past weeks in particular, I've often used the word dysynchronity, and I think the word is wrong. We are not, because dysynchronity would mean that some are behind others. And that I think is simply not correct. So I have to rethink what that really means if we live in a church in different places and in different contexts. And I think one of the fruits actually for the coming 12 months is we have all these theological questions. So I can see in the chat room and in the Q&A, people from different parts of the world and theologians. The theology, the questions that need to be answered now and to be addressed, they will not just do that in Rome. I think part of that question will have to be, how will every local church in its own theological faculty, in a contextual theology, answer to some of these questions? And how can we as theologians dive into much more into our own context and see what that really means. And I think we in the Western world have to become aware that we also live in a specific context, and that our context is, as Timothy was saying, is not the norm. But that will be a major challenge for us in rethinking. I also saw there's a document published this week about doing theology by Pope Francis, and it really asks to begin with the people. And I think this is what we have to do. As our students, we as professors, we have to go out and ask the people, what are your questions? What are your concerns? And then we have to rephrase them in theological formats and look what are the answers throughout history. And then, and also in dialogue with contemporary sciences. I mean, we are still not doing that as theologians. And we really have to change that. I think the digital world this week, these weeks, I think Timothy too, we heard so much about people living in the digital world and not just a parish around the block. So how are we going to face that? And how can we give meaning and help people to discover meaning in their lives? Because I think that's the purpose of our life is not to write great books, but to help people in their struggles.
Well, we've talked so far a lot about the discussions at the Synod, but Timothy, we all know that the participants in the Synod have been living on a diet of silence, referring to the fact that Pope Francis has asked them not to speak to the media while the session was in progress. So now that the Synod is over, how do you relate your experience of the Synod to media outlets? How do you recognize the fact that many journalists want to be able to spread the word of the Synod, and other journalists perhaps have their own agenda? So how do we go from this diet of silence to now sharing experiences?
I think we're only at the very beginning of understanding how to do that. First of all, we have to understand the importance of that diet of silence. Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, used to say that the Council, the Second Vatican Council, could be read as an event in faith or as a political event. And these gave you very, very different readings of what people were saying. And we had to preserve, in a sense, that protected space where we could talk to each other securely, looking for words, trying to find language, and therefore not letting people leap upon it and interpret it according to their own predetermined categories. They did this. Our reflections and meditations were released, and I was astonished and often amused by how they were interpreted. So when I gave a meditation, for example, on the Council of Jerusalem, mysteriously, I cannot think how, it was interpreted by some people as a campaign for gay rights, which is entirely puzzling. But as you say, Christine, this moment is now over. And therefore we're entering this new phase. And that requires that maybe we can try to have, if you want, a synodal relationship with the media. And that is going to be quite difficult, I think. It means actually learning to listen and learning to both subvert, if you want, the presuppositions that they bring to this debate, but also treating them with the utmost dignity, because without their collaboration, this event cannot succeed. Part of the synodal event is, as you said earlier, it's a digital event. It enters, as Myriam said, into every faculty, into all the media. And so we need a patient dialogue, I think, with the media, which has already begun. Very interesting. The first reaction of the media very often was one of disappointment. They didn't take great, bold decisions on some of the issues that we hoped. Now, I think what I had to recognize was that I was initially irritated because I thought they haven't understood what it's about at all. But then I had to recognize that I also had some disappointment. I couldn't just blame it on them, because I live in the media too. I'm also somebody who inhabits the digital content. And so I think we have to be extremely honest with the media and invite them to a similar honesty with ourselves as we find a new language, a new way of talking, which springs, as Myriam said, from listening. That everything will spring from a careful, imaginative attention that we give to what other people say.
It reminds me of the wonderful video that many of us saw, where you address the assembly saying that the Synod is not, we shouldn't liken it to winning a battle, but planting a tree. I thought, you're already giving us language for stretching our imaginations for what this process is about. Myriam, I would like to go to you. We know that women played a unique role in the Synod. In your experience, how did the presence of women impact this gathering? And what does it mean for the church? What does it mean for women?
Yeah, I think it was a unique event to have women present. But that was not just beginning now. It was from the beginning in the dioceses. We have to remember the Pope did not say we will do this process in Rome. It was for the first time he gave it back to the local churches. So the women were involved in the local churches. And then the women were in many dioceses involved in the teams to draft a report on what had happened in these churches. The women were involved in the continental meetings. And that was actually quite a surprise, because the Synod office in Rome asked the Episcopal conferences, would you like to have a meeting just of bishops among yourselves, or in the presence of the other faithful? I always say the other faithful, because the bishops are also members of the faithful. So, and the bishops overwhelmingly around the world said, we want to meet in the presence of, with the other faithful, in the presence of the people of God. So it was not new. Everybody who had been in the continental session had already had this experience. And the women, as well as the other non-members, is a term that not everybody was so happy with, because it's a negative term, not a positive term, but the non-members were all chosen on the basis of their Synod experience. And it was important for the whole meeting that these persons who were invited would indeed, if you like, also give a speed training to the bishops who did not have, who some of them had not any experience of synodality yet, but to help them and to remind at these round tables in the conversations how to do it, because they had a familiarity with it, and also to share their experience. What was also interesting was that I have not exactly checked it, but I would guess that about half of the round tables had a facilitator who was a woman. Now that was a very new experience, because in the past, of course, these would be very often, I guess, cardinals. And now you might have at one table 3 cardinals, and the conversation was guided by a woman from a very different continent that they might have been from. These facilitators, and actually the report in the end is saying that they very much appreciated to have these external facilitators who were not members, who were specially trained. The 3 days before the whole meeting started, they had again a training for this. And I think, so it is mentioned, this should be continued in the future. The conversation was very good. A little aside, one of the coffee breaks, one of the cardinals said to me, I've been at 7 synods. We have never had so few fights at this one. I mean, there are actually not really fights at all here, he said. Is it because there are women in our presence that we don't dare to fight with each other? It's a rhetoric question, maybe, I don't know. I do want to say, if you allow me, a little bit about what the document came up with regard to women. That might be of interest, and also because of some of the questions that I already saw in your Q&A. So the document has one section specifically on women. And from the beginning, the question was, how can we strengthen the role of women in the church? And it begins on the basis of baptism. That is really the crucial point. So baptism is 2 key words, I think, or maybe 3. Let's say 3 key words. So Timothy can have a different view on this, but I think there's baptism, there is listening, is a key word for all of us, and the Holy Spirit. I think those are 3 words that really came back in every conversation, and that's very different from the past, where we were focusing on the hierarchy or on ordination, on Jesus Christ. Of course, we are focusing on Jesus Christ. There is no spirit without Christ. There's no question about that, but the focus is different. So from the baptism, we look to the co-responsibility of every single baptized person in the different role that they have in the whole body within the people of God. And the document is then saying that really they would want, and there was an overwhelming majority. I mean, all these documents, all the points were voted on by a minimum of 80%, if not 90, 99% at times, where they were saying women should participate in substantial roles of responsibility in pastoral care and in ministry. And what does that mean? In the context of the whole document, it doesn't mean Rome is now going to install these ministries. There is also a call to see which ministry is necessary in which context. So you in the United States are invited, so to speak, to think, what do we need in the United States, which might be different from the Amazon, and we might be different from Manila, for example. There is no need to have identical ministries for the whole world. There was also a call saying, if the Pope can appoint women in the Roman Curia at very high positions, what can be done that bishops do the same in their dioceses? And there is a call for canon lawyers to make the provisions. There was, of course, a call for women in the diaconates. And I was really surprised how that conversation went. There was no conversation about women and priesthood. That wasn't really on the table, but the diaconates. And it took a turn that I had never expected. The conversation went in this direction. We have the permanent diaconate and we have the diaconate leading to the priesthood. And they said, maybe 60 years after Vatican II, we should have a reflection again. What does this permanent diaconate actually really mean? And are these deacons not way too much in the liturgy? Should they not fulfill other tasks? And is the diaconate as a transitory diaconate, is that really, what is its theological meaning leading to priesthood? Do we really need that? So that is a very interesting conversation that we will have to have. And I'm sure not just in the next 12 months, that will take a longer time. But what does that then really mean? And the question was then raised, or the proposal was made, to take up the studies that are already there on women and the diaconate and include newer studies that we also have. And I think it's the only subject for which a timeline is mentioned. Please come with a proposal in 12 months. I think there's no other subject in which there is any timeline, but this is one of 12 months. I was surprised because we also heard this from the floor, women who have no access to theological training and theological faculties, pontifical theological universities or faculties. So there was a call to have that and to have women there as teachers, as well as in seminary formation. There was a call for language in the liturgy. It should be much more women-friendly, and there should be more stories about women, biblical stories, maybe reflect again what stories have we elected for our readings, but also stories of saints and women of relevance for today. And finally, another surprise for me, we do have women as judges in many instances already, but there was a clear call that women can be judges in all canonical processes at all levels in the church. So, I mean, for me, these are immense steps forward, and also the language we had about this. And this was not just a simple two-thirds majority. These points were taken with an overwhelming majority, peace and calm. Nobody was shouting, nobody left the room. There was indeed consensus on these issues.
Perhaps I could just add a little word.
Please do.
Because I thought the image of so many women at the table, there could have been more, of course, but it was a reminder that we are all missionary disciples, as Francis likes to stress. That's our primary identity, whether you're a cardinal or a bishop or whatever. I don't know what Myriam would think, But there was a little bit of tension in the air, which I think is an interesting one, between those who had a language of complementarity, reciprocity of gender roles, and those who dismissed this. And I think there's some exploration to be done here. I was very fascinated by what Myriam said about the cardinal who remarked, maybe because the women had been there were less quarrels. I have a feeling that whatever complementarity or reciprocity there is to be, we'll only discover very slowly. I don't think we can lay down in advance some great vision of the complementarity of the roles of men and women. Normally, when we do that, it ends up with subjection. So what we have to do is let this emerge as we live together, talk together as fellow disciples. So that maybe at the beginning, you know, a cardinal might look around the desk, around the round table and say, gosh, there are 4 women here. Maybe at the end, he didn't say that. He said, oh, there's Myriam and there's Lillian and there's Mary, my sisters, and I'm their brother. So I think the consequences of that are actually very profound. It will take a long time for us to discover.
Okay. All right. I would like to ask 2 more questions before we look at some of the questions in the chat. So the first one, I'm going to direct to you, Timothy. I was really moved in the beginning of our conversation where you said that one of your main tasks was to think about what separated people and what made conversation difficult. And you were talking about the people that were in the room. But what about, one of the challenges of the Synod is those people who haven't yet engaged this process. Some people who remain suspicious of it. Do you have a sense of what do you think these people are afraid of or angry about? And what can we do to encourage more people to participate?
One prominent group, I think, are the priests. I think for many priests, the synodal process is quite threatening and frightening, because it does suggest that the world, the church we inhabit, is going to be changed fairly radically. And they may wonder what their role is to be. Pope Francis very often condemns the poison of clericalism. He did this extremely strongly at the end of this part of the Synod. And I think he's completely and utterly right. I think that the church will only flourish if we transcend, if we free ourselves from the idea of the priesthood as this superior caste of people who in some ways are unaccountable, who don't have to respond with openness to the people of God. But I do think that to help this happen, we have to evolve a richer understanding of the priesthood, which is not clericalist. So the priests are happy to embrace priesthood. They need some sense of a corps d'esprit, of a common service. We talked a lot about the collegiality of bishops. What is it that binds priests together in a diocese so that they may be humble servants of the people of God? I mean, I'm a Dominican, I'm a brother, I'm a religious. And I think that gives me already, as it were, a firm rock to stand on as one tries to move beyond clericalism. But what about diocesan clergy? How can we show that they are affirmed, loved, supported? Many of the reports showed that they felt isolated, undermined, and they need support and love. So what vision of their vocation can we offer which is fundamentally relational. You see, one of the beautiful things is seeing the bishops and the cardinals at the round tables in the middle of other people, unordained people, was that it's not that it somehow watered down the episcopal nature of the synod. It actually showed what it meant to be a bishop, which is to be related to the people of God. It was a better expression of what it meant to be a bishop or a priest than if they were all alone, as they effectively were in previous synods. So I think in the year to come, in the 11 months to come, let us try and think how we can encourage priests to evolve with us, in relationship with us, of some vision of what a ministry of service would look like.
So Myriam, I would invite you to add to that. And then the question I'd like to move into also is, everybody wants to know what's going to happen between October and October. So we all know that Pope Francis extended the synod for this additional year. What is going to transpire in the next 12 months before the October 2024 gathering?
Well, I think we have to journey together and we have to invite everybody. So as I said at the beginning, the train has started, but the train is at a page where everybody can still join and people should be invited to join. I think it would be great if we could listen to other people, and this was also several times in the document. We should not speak about women, but with women. We should not speak about the homeless, but with the homeless. We should not speak. So make these people, make everybody into a protagonist and be aware that the truth can come from there. I think, Timothy, we were both extremely touched by the story of a very young woman in the Synod who told us about her sister who, as a transsexual, had kind of left the church, had got out of contact with the church, and it was her grandmother who, in a conversation with her, kind of opened a new way for her and into a conversation. And what was really sad in the story was that the young woman then, before the celebration of I think it was the 50th anniversary of the grandparents, went back in her home country and she went to confession, and the priest refused her absolution. The young woman then later took her life. So that was a very touching story. I think there was another aspect. This was not just, the meeting was not just an intellectual meeting, but it was a meeting about faith and how we believe and how we struggle with the questions we have. And there were not clear answers. There were no textbooks from which to quote, so to speak, but we had to discover this together. So the question is, how can we, with all the people around the globe, Catholics and non-Catholics? It's also a question that I see in your Q&A, the question of many people, what is the role of other Christians, the ecumenical dimension of this? And there were indeed so many, there were delegates, official delegates from other churches. They were also participating at the round tables in the conversation, but they also were given the floor, they were sharing their experience. And in the preparation also to this synod, that was not only in dioceses, but it was also special conferences were organized in Rome, but also in other parts, to listen on how is synodality understood in other churches, what can we learn from them. And I think it's that conversation will continue, and there is a call that there will be more delegates next year. By the way, if I may say, and this participation of other Christians with whom we are walking should continue on all levels in our church. I think, and this is also mentioned in the document, people living in a mixed marriage are a great opportunity to which we can learn from them. How do they live their life? And in this listening church, I think it's really necessary that we listen more carefully to their experience on how their faith is enriched, and not to think that it is endangered, but how it is enriched by the presence of the other, because I think it's in the conversation with the other that you much better discover your own identity and begin to ask questions. So for the next year, as I already said earlier, theological faculties will also have a lot to do a contextual rethinking, but also to ask themselves the question, we should not begin with principles, we should begin with people. We should begin with the questions of the people. And how can we respond to that? Then I think in the parishes, we can ask, with whom are we actually meeting here? And when we have our soup kitchens and other places, how can we listen to the people and their story and ask how they can reveal to us what the Holy Spirit is saying to the church on where to go next. So these are processes that I think we can do at a local level.
I would add, if I might,
Yes, I was going to ask you to speak, Timothy, because so many of the questions that are in the Q&A have to do with the question of ecumenism and the question of what can people in local parishes do. So Timothy, I would invite you to build on Myriam on those points that so many people are interested in.
What I just first of all say is I think it's you have the synodal process is a delicate child learning to walk, easily falling over. And every one of us has a responsibility, whether we cherish that delicate plant, that tender child, or whether we cynically and with despair speak words that undermine it and subvert it. So I would say everybody has a profound responsibility to cherish in hope what has begun. I also think it became very evident during the last stages of this stage of the Synod. It became very evident that there needs to be, as Myriam said, a profound involvement of theologians, because we listen to each other and let ourselves be touched by each other. But we also listen, as it were, together to the word of God. And we need good theological reflection, I think, to see how the word of God illuminates this time of pregnancy. You call it a time of pregnancy for a new church. We can be like Sarah, you know, when she hears yet again, she's going to have a child, she laughs bitterly, oh, nothing's going to happen. Or do we give each other hope and courage on the journey? Every one of us has a responsibility there. I think on the ecumenical delegates, Myriam, you'd had some thoughts, I think.
The involvement of the ecumenical delegates.
Yeah, like I mentioned already, they were there. There were 12 of them. There was also an interesting thing at the opening ceremony. We first had a prayer organized by Taizé before everybody went on a retreat. Actually, I think this was a great idea as well, to have a retreat outside of Rome. Everybody put on the bus. And we all know this, when you go on the bus with a group, it's even if you don't know the people, but there is something happens already by moving to another place and you don't know where you're going. And we're all leaving Rome in the evening around 9 o'clock and people were waiting. Timothy was, I think, with the last group about to leave. I still remember you were rather tired sitting there outside waiting for your pickup, so to speak. And then you all went. So the ecumenical event was then a few days later when the official opening was, and we were all processing in from St. Peter's Square. And there was a conversation apparently going on whether ecumenical guests could process in or not, but they did. And I think the people who were there were really very pleased to be there and participated fully. Yeah. So I think that's a very good, that was a very good thing. And again, it's a call, there's a whole section in the document on ecumenism. There is a clear call to continue this involvement on an ecumenical level. We cannot be a synodal church without being ecumenical, and we cannot be ecumenical without being synodal. I think the two go together.
There's so many excellent questions in the chat. It shows that the Lit Press has a wonderful audience and readership. One person is asking Myriam about the role of canon law in this process and You mentioned in one of your earlier contributions that there are several canon lawyers involved and that work is important for moving the synod forward. Could you say a little bit about what the canon lawyers are doing in this process?
Well, I was surprised, certainly in light of Vatican II, how often the floor was calling for canonical implications. And I remember a cardinal canon lawyer saying very early in the process, we should look into canonical implications and draw consequences, because otherwise we risk that too much will be beautiful thinking and beautiful reflection, but it won't really get hold of the community. If you go, I'm at the moment working on making a list, and there's so many points with canonical implications, and to see what can we prioritize, what can be done rather quickly. Already before the synod, but it was also in the synod, many people asked, can diocesan and parish pastoral council be made obligatory? And there was an overwhelming request for that, to do that. In a contribution that at some point I was allowed to make was that I said they should maybe not only be obligatory, but we could look into also like a presbyteral council, for which decisions should they be obligatory involved. So I give an example where I can imagine that. If you do a reconfiguration of a parish with other parishes, you merge them or you separate them. The presbyteral council needs to be heard by the bishop before he can make that decision legitimately. And I could well imagine that a change in canon law would be the parish pastoral council of the parish concerned should be heard, as well as the diocesan pastoral council. And so you would then listen to the people who are really touched by it, but you would also make decisions that later on will be received because the people have participated in it. And these are simple questions. You can do the same for schools and reordering of schools. So that is one of the things, but there were far more canonical questions that we will have to look into. And one of them is the question of accountability. There was a clear call for a much more accountable structure. And this is, of course, has much to do with the crisis on sexual abuse. The question of transparency, we were talking earlier about the media. Without the media, the whole issue of sexual abuse in our church would not be where we are at the moment, because the church so far has struggled. And I can talk from my time on the Pontifical Commission for Minors. The church has struggled and is struggling with attending to these issues, and at times seems to be doing this only when the media is pressing for it. So there is a clear call for more transparency also in these procedures, more accountability. And I thought it was interesting, Timothy, I thought it was really interesting when the bishops were saying they feel that it is a burden for them to be at the same time a father to the priest and to the faithful and a judge in these cases. Mm-hmm. And that they don't know how to hold that tension and ask, can we not give that task of a judge to somebody else? Now, in some ways, it means they're asking for a division of powers. Mm-hmm. And I think the faithful in a number of countries around the world have also called for that. And I think we should seriously look into that. So the canonical questions are there. And another question is this question of if we decentralize on the issue, what does that mean for diversity and unity? Mm-hmm. And again, our Peter and Paul seminar has just completed a project on that. And we are very pleased that in 2 or 3 weeks, we will have a book launch in Rome on the publication that we have, thinking on what does this mean. And at the book launch, the cardinal from Bombay, who used to be the president of the Federation of Asian Bishops Conferences, so somebody from a very different culture, will speak on what does this mean to have diversity in unity when it comes to teaching, exercising the teaching office by bishops and by episcopal conferences. So yeah, it's a lot of work to do. And again, the canon lawyers, they should go into a conversation with the theologians, not just by themselves. And the canon lawyers from, I would say, around the world should participate in this and not just leave it to the Roman, because the canonical principles will have to be implemented in a specific context.
So we're headed to our last moments. Before I turn it over to Therese for a conclusion, many of the comments in the chat and the questions, use the word hope. And I'm wondering about, what do you want us to know about the Synod? Is there something that brings you hope from your experience? Sometimes a surprise element that surprised you that gave you hope? Could we end on each of you giving us just a sentence or two about what you would want us to know about looking to the future, and maybe what might bring you hope about this process? So Timothy, could we start with you?
If I had one sentence, I would say it's joy. It was a joyful occasion, a very tiring occasion sometimes. Sometimes just to get the work done, I had to get up at 4:30 in the morning. But the joy triumphed over everything. And Tyler de Chardin said, joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God.
Thank you. Myriam?
In the room were people who are at war in their home countries. There were people from the Ukraine, there were Russians in the room. There were people from the Middle East, there were people from different African countries where there are really fights. And I thought, what a wonderful method are we developing here to be able to have a frank but constructive process of dialoguing with each other, of listening to each other. And if the church would be, so that gives me hope, because if the church would be able to be an example to the world on how to live with diverse views, opinions, interests, I think that would be an extreme gift to the church that we could do. So the fact that we were able to have this as men and women in all our different roles, with all our different experiences and responsibilities, I thought that was, for me, that's a great sign of hope. And actually, next year, 2024, we will have the second session of the Synod, and that will almost automatically, I think, lead us into the Jubilee year, which has as theme hope. So if the Synod, I'm really very hopeful that the Synod will be, the beginning of a year in which we can celebrate hope and take courage from that. Thank you.
What an amazing conversation. I will thank you both and turn it over to Therese to wrap up the session.
Wow, well, this has been such a great conversation that 100% demonstrates that we are really just at the beginning of something exciting and challenging and joyful and hopeful all at once. Myriam and Timothy, you have allowed us to share some of your experience of the Synod, and we are so grateful to you for this insider glimpse that you've offered us today. As a reminder to everyone who registered for the event, you will receive a 20% discount and free shipping. So place your orders at litpress.org. Just enter that code NOVWEB23 before November 15th. Once again, thank you to Dr. Myriam Wijlens, Father Timothy Radcliffe, Dr. Kristen Colbert for today's really informative and truly engaging conversation. And to everyone who participated today, we look forward to seeing you at our next online event. As always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.